and welcome to the second of our tree-based days. We are in Swansea city centre and we're going to be looking at issues around trees outside Woodland, so street tree protests in particular. So I'm outside Tesco's in the city centre, and behind me you can see two trees. And they're a really nice example of one of the reasons why trees in our cities cause a massive headache for planners and for people looking after our highways. So the tree behind me here is a big, beautiful London plane tree. It's about 60 or 70 years old. These trees get absolutely huge. And if they're not planted in the right place, they start to do all kinds of things like push up pavements, and their roots get into the services. And in a city like Swansea, which has grown up kind of chaotically after large areas of it were bombed in the war, very often the people trying to landscape our streets don't even know what services are under the street. There's pipes everywhere and there's conduits everywhere. And they can cause a real headache for people who look after roads and for planners. But in terms of what they do for wildlife, this big tree is doing a hell of a lot more than this little tree. What's happened in Swansea city centre, what we're going to look at, is developments like the arena development just behind us on the other side of the Oystermouth Road put in planning applications to remove 200 semi-mature and mature trees from this area of the city that already doesn't have a lot of canopy cover. Another development in the Kingsway is what started the street tree protests in the city, and we're going to talk about that one now. So one of the reasons why we have such massive, beautiful trees on our streets in the UK is because of Victorian street planners. They loved to put big, majestic, large species trees in our city centres. And with over 80% of the UK's population living in urban or semi-urban areas, very often the trees that we encounter are not in natural woodlands at all. They're in our streets, and they're really, really important to us, to the aesthetic of our city, and actually to our well-being as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about why street trees are so important ecologically and for us and for our society as well. One of the things about Britain is it's one of the least wooded countries in Europe. Britain has about a cover of about 13% of the landscape with woodland, whereas the European average is about 38% of the land surface to be wooded. So the trees on our streets are actually even more important than they would be anyway. So street trees have myriad reasons for why they are important for the planet and for us and for nature. Obviously, if you're looking at a tree like this with a big trunk that's been laying down carbon for decades and decades, it's a carbon store. They also deal with pollution by their canopies trapping physical particulate falling out, and also because they are adding oxygen to our atmosphere. A mature oak tree adds around 200,000 litres of oxygen every year to our atmosphere. Their pollution trapping measures are known to have an impact on the prevalence of asthma in city centres. They also have loads of benefits for wildlife in areas of the city that can be really, really sparse in green places for species to live and for habitat. They provide habitats for insects, for birds. They also, you can see from these trunks, there's lichen and moss growing on them. They provide spaces for nature in our cities. So as well as all these ecosystem benefits, they're also really good for us. There is evidence for everything from crime reduction by the presence of trees in our cities to the fact that students are able to concentrate more if they can see trees outside the windows of the places where they're trying to study, their schools. They are also good for the economy. There's evidence that shoppers spend more time on streets that have large trees on them than streets that have small trees on them. Their roots are helping to slow down floodwaters, reducing localised flooding in extreme events. And of course, if you think they're not doing anything for our microclimate, go out on a hot sunny day, stand out in the sun for 10 minutes, then stand under a tree canopy for 10 minutes. They actively reduce temperature by providing shade, and also because of the huge amounts of water that they're transpiring through their canopies in the summer. So the trees and the plants in our city are what we term the green infrastructure, compared to the grey infrastructure, the buildings and the roads that are around us. And when we think about that green infrastructure, It's the big street trees that are really the kind of trump card. They do the most for us, they do the most for nature, and they do the most for the planet as well. So everywhere where people and local authorities and developers and planners have to try and share the same space with people who are environmentalists and really passionate about the trees in our landscape, there is always going to be clashes over tree felling. If you look back at things like the Newbury Bypass campaign, there have always been these historical events where activists tried to prevent developers and local authorities from felling trees. And a few years ago in Sheffield in the north of England, when that city council entered into a contract with developers that required the felling of 5,500 trees, those protests became something very different. They grew to a point where they were in the international media, they were featured in an article in the New York Times, and things got really, really nasty in that city. To give some context about that, I'm actually going to read you a quote from one of the activists who was involved in those street tree protests. "There have been really dark moments," says Paul Selby with feeling. "Waking up to find 200 police on the street, your neighbours being beaten up by private security officers or taken to court on false pretences. It sounds like some kind of a dystopian nightmare." But Paul is describing events that happened in suburban Sheffield, where for 3 years he has been involved in the Sheffield Tree Action Group. And to date, when this quote was written in 2018, the council has so far felled 5,500 street trees under a £2.2 billion scheme that has absolutely infuriated locals. So what happened? Those protests really turned to a point where the police were heavily involved, there were security firms, there were court cases, and there was an investigation that found that whilst Sheffield City Council had certainly breached best practice, they avoided prosecution. Roll on 2 years and that coalition of the council, the activist groups and the residents groups have come to a point, helped by Woodland Trust, the largest woodland charity in the UK, so an NGO, and have been able to form a coalition to bring forward a new street tree policy for the city that's aiming to do things a little bit differently. So roll forward 2 years and that Sheffield Tree Action Group is now part of a multi-stakeholder group in Sheffield, working with the council, working with local authorities and with businesses and with residents groups to come up with a brand new street tree working policy to try and do things a bit better and look after the existing street trees in that city a little bit better. To find out more about that, we're going to talk to Woodland Trust's Jo Coles. So, hi students, as I said in the video, we're chatting to some external experts as part of today's course, and we're talking today to Jo Coles, who is Urban Programme Lead at Woodland Trust. The Woodland Trust are the UK's biggest woodland and tree charity, so a really major stakeholder when it comes to managing trees outside woodland. And we're going to chat today to Jo about his work looking after and campaigning for trees on our streets around the UK. Hi Jo.
Hi, yeah, so yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the Urban Programme Lead for the Woodland Trust. Strictly, my job is a campaigner, so I'm there to try and change policy and influence decisions about the management of trees, particularly the felling of trees where it's unnecessary. So there are examples from the past in Sheffield, for example, where residents were really up in arms, really angry about the removal of trees unnecessarily from their city streets. And I think it's just really important at this point to say the most powerful tool that I hold is public opinion. So it's supporting communities with their outrage to get those messages across to decision makers that we can then use to change decisions for the better, but also as examples for influencing policy at even national level, because ultimately, people and public opinion is what changes policy, not moral duty or not the appropriate management of trees or nature or anything. It is public opinion that's the driving force. It's not specifically about campaigning in the typical sense of raising public awareness, but actually a lot of what I do is technical. So there's a lot of behind the scenes influencing where, you know, we can take the latest understanding, the latest scientific evidence and research to try and influence from a technical perspective within an organization, so within a government department or a council, or indeed a corporate funder or partner that we might have. But then there's the other element, of course, is that public outrage. But actually, you know, the Woodland Trust's got more than 500,000 members, and that in itself gives me a much amplified voice when I have an opinion on something that a council might not take for granted from a scientist or a member of the public, but actually a person working for a charity with 500,000 people are all lined up ready to sign my petition makes a big difference.
That's a really interesting perspective, actually. I think it's something maybe we don't talk about often enough in geography, the different ways that stakeholders are important. We might just think everything happens at government and government level, essentially, whether that's local government, regional or national. And actually NGOs are really, particularly for anything environmental, NGOs are really essential, aren't they? Just for that huge base of people.
They really are, and I suppose, I mean, it is often the elephant in the room, but Sheffield is the prime example of all of those different elements actually coming together in a single path, although very convoluted it might have been. But it started off with residents petitioning, protesting on the streets, trying to get the public, you know, the public awareness raised so that more members of the public, more communities can support their arguments, which was a really powerful place to be. But actually the credibility of NGOs like the Woodland Trust, Trees for Cities, the local Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, actually getting involved in those conversations too, it amplifies that voice. But then, you know, we have a different function. So we're not just a campaigning organisation. We put a lot of funding into local authorities and other organisations for tree planting. So we don't just have that public opinion voice, we've also got that financial incentive to be listened to. So, you know, Sheffield, again, we're now in a position where in the next few months, in the next week, we'll be announcing the Emergency Tree Fund, which is 12 local authorities that are essentially going to share a £3.5 million funding pot between them. When we have those sorts of carrots to dangle in front of decision makers, that's a really powerful thing that residents will not have. Government doesn't invest in the same way in specific local authorities. We might have big tree planting budgets across the UK, but none are targeted at a specific city. But where we've got that as a carrot, and we've also got the stick of bad publicity and public protest and public opinion, you know, those are things that can actually be used to great strength that are often overlooked by governments, by communities, and by local authorities too.
Absolutely, and I think it's a very important point, actually, particularly in the way that we study the environment and climate in geography these days, how important NGOs and that non-governmental voice is as government becomes pressurized from multiple directions, should we say. So I wanted to ask you, one of the things when I started researching for this module that actually was kind of shocking to me is quite how high our level of felling is in the UK. I think fell, the kind of standard statistic is 58 to 60 street trees every day in the UK, and that statistic I know is from a few years ago. And to me that raises the question, why have we got such a problem with felling street trees? What is it about? Presumably that tells us something that it's actually quite tricky to let a tree grow big and safely in the UK surrounded by concrete. Like why are trees outside of woodland challenging, I guess is my question.
I mean, that's a question I grapple with myself, to be quite honest, because I think there are so many different angles to that question. So one of them is, yes, it's very difficult in a built-up urban environment. You know, the temperature can be up to 10 degrees different in the middle of a city to what it is on the outskirts. So in itself, 10 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but for geography students, 10 degrees difference in temperature is significant. And actually, a native tree that's not expecting those conditions to be faced with, it has a real challenge surviving. There are all
So
the
just actually that physical environment is more demanding outside a forest.
It's incredibly demanding. You know, you've got paved surfaces, so you don't have the soft rain absorption into the ground. So water availability is a big issue for trees, and that's one of the factors that leads to uneven paving and blames for trees, you know, damaging underground surfaces because the tree is rightly searching for water, and actually the water and air availability under a paved surface is you know, it's almost non-existent, but there is a very fine layer of uncompacted space between the paving surface and the soil beneath it. So that is where the adventitious roots of a tree will instantly explore, looking for the water and air and nutrients that it needs. And that's one of the conflicts that we see as a negative aspect of trees, a disservice.
So this is when we get the, like, we have to rip out £10,000 worth of tree asset because there's a 2 centimetre bulge in a paving stone and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's that sort of thing. And actually the cost of taking that paving up and re-leveling it can be in the hundreds of pounds. But, you know, until we recognise the value of that tree as an asset, and this is one of the overarching things, and I think the main issue is it's a disconnect between people and trees. We've lost the understanding of how they survive and what they actually need to survive well. You can't just put a tree in a hole in the ground and expect that it's just the same as being planted in an open field. There's so many more challenges for the tree and so many more challenges for people. A tree losing a branch in a woodland, that's just great ecology. You know, that's a positive thing. Tree losing its branch over a main road or a pedestrian footpath where there are a few hundred people a day, the increasing risk of that tree or branch falling on something either damaging or dangerous is massively increased as well. So you find that in an urban environment, especially local authorities and the custodians of trees, they want their trees to be specimens that you'd find in an arboretum. So a perfect example of a tree, structurally sound, no risk of losing branches, no risk of collapse. And that's, again, one of the big challenges with urban trees, or particularly trees outside woods, where people are on a much more regular basis. It's about, I think they call it high target occupancy. So in a rural woodland, you might get 10 dog walkers a day visiting a woodland and walking under a tree that's risky. That's manageable risk. You know, right. The chances of that causing death or injury are much reduced. But when you've got a children's playground underneath the chestnut tree, for example, rightly so, you know, there is a lot more nervousness about the safety of those people, because obviously even a small defect in that tree could have catastrophic circumstances.
So one of the things that we're seeing more and more in urban landscapes is trying to, I guess, mitigate risk by getting those big trees out of the way and put smaller trees in place. I think that's one of the things that we're looking at in this module.
Councils, when answering freedom of information, they have very specific answers that they're prepared to give. So it will be number of trees felled. They won't necessarily give reasons for the felling of all those trees. So it can lead to confusion. You know, a council might be felling 58 healthy, mature street trees a year. At the same time, a council might be thinning some woodland to improve the health of the woodland more generally and removing those trees. So you've got to be careful about the evidence that underpins it too, but it's still an alarming trend because of the fact that it's a downward trend.
Every year we know more and more about how important it is to have trees in our urban landscapes, and every year we seem to have fewer and fewer of them, particularly large ones.
Yeah, and I do think that there is this kind of, as you just mentioned, that there's a fear for the future and what the future entails, and therefore is it better now to just sort of wipe the canvas clean and create a really nice, I see it it should be landscape architecture when you're talking about designing urban locations. I see it often as much more the kind of grand designs. This is what it is. This is what it could look like. Let's go and bulldoze a lot and start again and build a new garden from the scratches. But you know, that's not appropriate when it comes to climate change and the climate emergency, because you're not considering the timescales that the existing trees have been there and established, and those future trees will need to get up and running to the benefits that the original ones were providing. So,
right, which can be decades and decades of time to lay down carbon and establish themselves.
Yeah, and also to you know, it's very easy to think of trees as sort of annual plants. This is what this tree needs. Therefore, if we give it those conditions, it's going to have a great life. But trees have to actually get used to their environment as an individual organism. You know, an oak tree that has been growing in an urban city centre will be a lot more resilient to salt and to temperature changes than perhaps a field-grown one that if you suddenly paved around it and dumped a load of road salt around its roots, it would probably keel over the next year. But you know, they can actually have their individual tolerances built up over a lifetime, and that's another reason why, if a tree's been there for 150 years and it's still in leaf every year, you know, it's coping. It can deal with that environment. So okay, it might need a helping hand, but in the same way, you know, if I got a disease tomorrow that was quite debilitating, you wouldn't say get rid of me and bring someone else in. You'd say, how do we manage that disease to keep that person doing their job for as long as possible?
I guess it all comes down to what you said at the start, actually, that until we value particularly the large trees in our urban landscapes properly, we have a different perspective on the costs associated with looking after them that isn't right, really.
That's it, and that's why it's so important that actually, you know, this is a really exciting module, because people are going to be learning about the realities of climate change and getting that sort of closer, in-depth understanding, and that's something that's been lost, certainly within the sector, but in general across the UK. You know, people have a disconnect, and it's that kind of drop in the ocean thing, as you know, it's just one tree, it's outside my house, I'm not that bothered, but it's the cumulative effect that makes a big difference. And until everybody is aware of that, just like climate change, you know, my carbon footprint's only tiny compared to British Airways, doesn't mean I don't have a responsibility to do something about it.
So, Joe, I want to go on to talking a little bit about Sheffield, because it was such a turning point for street tree campaigning in the UK. And I know certainly whenever we read anything about it, even just from that press footage, which obviously won't be the full picture, it sounds so incredibly intense, and actually some of the things that went on were quite shocking. So could you tell us all a little bit about what happened in Sheffield and how it got so bad?
Yeah, I mean, if I give you an overview of the timeline, I think that would be quite eye-opening, really, and how it sort of came about and happened. So it was, I believe it was 2012 that Sheffield City Council, reviewing the management of its highways, entered into what's called a private finance initiative with a company called amenity. So they're like one of these big infrastructure organisations. So yeah, they entered into this contract with for managing their highways, because they were looking at their highways as a public asset. So the road infrastructure, keeping highways flowing, is good for the business, good for economy, good for people. So that was their priority. When they signed the contract, though, it wasn't really considered that trees were an integral part of that infrastructure. They were a part of it, and they were part of the contract for the highway company to manage. But actually, tree officers at the council weren't involved in decisions. They didn't influence that contract or how it would look. So, I mean, it all went fairly quiet. It wasn't a big thing, because, you know, highways contracts have been done like that for quite a while. It's not a unique situation. But what started happening was residents across the city started noticing that hang on, the trees on my street are being removed to facilitate this new paving, but there's nothing wrong with the trees. It concerns me. And it was kind of over 3 years, I think it was a steady realization by individual community groups across the city that actually it's not just our area that's been affected here. It seems like it's across the entire city, and the
Just
residents
kind of noticing that removal of trees going on here, and pockets all over the city.
Yeah, and lots of community groups all starting to share their experiences and realizing that there's something inherently wrong here. You know, it's not just a few trees here and there. It's almost like there is a plan to get rid of mature trees. The trouble is, with it being a private finance initiative, all of that information was kept fairly secret. It wasn't transparent because it was all under this private finance initiative, and it was commercially sensitive information. So instead of it being a case where residents could demand answers from the council, the residents were demanding answers from the council, who were contracted not to share those pieces of information. So it got to sort of 2015, I think, when the action groups, the various different community groups, they started to come together under an umbrella of Sheffield Tree Action Groups, STAG, which that was kind of the big turning point for me. Was it's not just a few communities that have got issue here. This is the citizens of Sheffield up in arms against their own council, and that's where it started to escalate. So the Woodland Trust got involved fairly early on with some light touch support for specific trees. So the Chelsea Road elm was a big iconic tree with a rare butterfly in its crown. You know, one of the few elm trees to survive Dutch elm disease and still be standing today. And when that was threatened for removal, it became this flashpoint for a lot of the NGOs to get involved too, because of the environmental value of that tree. And then over the next few years, you know, the fellings continued, the tensions escalated because there was no real collaboration or communication between the contractor, the council, the residents. And eventually, I think it was 2017-18, just about when the Woodland Trust decided it really needs to step into the urban realm and deal with some of these issues, it was found out that through lots of determined efforts by residents, that within that contract, the council had handed over the management of 36,000 street trees to the contractor as part of the highway network. So that's a lot of trees, but that's essentially all the trees on the highway network in Sheffield. Within the contract, there was actually a clause that said by the end of this contract, the contractor must return 36,000 trees to the council. So not an increase, not a decrease, the same number of trees by the end of it. But because a lot of those trees were considered old, and before the end of the 25-year contract, lots of them might need work doing on them or removing, rather than steadily manage all those trees on a need for need basis, so when a tree becomes dangerous, we manage it then, there seems to have been an element of a preemptive, well, this tree's only got 10, 15 years left. Let's do it at the same time as all the others on this street and save some time, effort, and money. So there was actually a clause in there that said, you know, it said no fewer than 17,500 trees must be felled and replaced by the end of that contract. And that's the bit that really worried me, because essentially what that was saying is it's okay for the contractor to fell half of the street trees and replace them over a 25-year period of time. And that's where actually the evidence and the data really comes in, because you might think that makes economic sense. You know, if it's only got 15 years left, put a new one in now and it's on its way to providing some of those benefits. But if you take a healthy mixed age population and cull half and replace them over a 25-year period, what you've got is half are mixed urban forest of different age classes, and then half where they're all almost exactly the same age.
Right.
In the life of a tree, 25 years is nothing. So, you know, planting 17,500 trees over 25 years, they're all going to die at the same sort of time, really, depending on the species. So it's not about sustainable management, and that's where those kind of issues really come to light. But a lot of
it's kind of amazing to hear it from that perspective, actually, that actually you get a sense of just the degree to which it was kind of this perfect storm of rapidly thrown together contracts without talking to the right experts, without communicating with residents, without communicating with people who understand those kinds of management plans, and essentially a financial contract steering an ecological asset for a city with the wrong decision making behind it. And you can kind of, I suppose, when I've never heard Sheffield actually explained in that way, and you really can see how that perfect storm just exploded, actually.
Yeah, and from an economic benefit, from an engineering perspective, it's like, you know, if you've got a lamppost that goes out on your street, but they're all nearly due for replacement, it's more cost effective to go in and replace them all at once. It makes perfect sense. But actually, when you're talking about a living being that's got many hundreds of years of life left in it, you know, using those sorts of really hard-nosed calculations are dangerous, and it has proved exactly that for both the contractor and Sheffield Council.
I guess because you're missing an entire element of value, aren't you? You're not kind of assessing the value from that ecological perspective.
And this is where, although, you know, iTree is an incredibly valuable tool for putting a price tag on trees, but I have personal concerns with that, because the moment you start talking about anything living in economic terms, you know, do we get to the point where a human life has a financial cost associated with it? It's a dangerous way to look at things. It's the best language we've got, and it's a really useful tool, but it's always got to be caveated, in my mind, with the intrinsic value of a living tree that is priceless.
That we can't put a number on.
Yeah. Chelsea Elm is still there today. It got a reprieve, and it's safe. And I'm really pleased that over the past 3 years, residents and the council and the contractor, including lots of subject matter experts, have agreed to come around the table, partly because of the public outcry, and that wasn't going away anytime soon. You know, the protests were just getting more and more, well, I forgot what the word is, but the protests were just getting more and more intense, I suppose is the way to put it. But because of that, and some of the work that residents are doing behind the scenes, and the Woodland Trust and others, you know, again, it comes back to that different ways of influencing. I can't take part in direct action. If I go and chain myself to a tree or climb it, and I'd love to do that in many circumstances.
Would you?
Yeah, but I work for a charity, and the charity would not be able to support my actions in doing that. So, you know, we can't condone direct action. Sometimes it is the only thing that makes a difference, and Sheffield is a perfect illustration of that. But what we can do in the background is be writing letters to the Secretary of State and to influence MPs and government to try and get attention brought onto it. And Michael Gove, at the time the Secretary of State for the Environment, really took interest in Sheffield. And there was a very clear government interest in what was going on, an intention to intervene. And, you know, in the environment bill that's due out later this year, there is a duty on councils to consult before felling trees. How that will look, I don't know. But when a government sees the fallout from Sheffield that was all instigated by residents, and put something in like a duty to consult, it gives that impetus then for those decision makers to realise this is not just a load of tree hugging hippies kicking off about a few trees. It's got international attention, and it's got government's attention, we now have to do something about this. The Forestry Commission did an investigation and heavily criticised Sheffield for its actions. So that kind of forced their hand to come to the table and sit around in mediated talks with residents and agree to draw up a new street tree strategy for the management of trees in future, which is due to be made public this year, fully launched as a published document. It's already a work in progress. It's an active document that is already steering decisions around trees, but it's crucially involved the residents. It's been co-produced, and therefore it's consultation in action.
Sheffield's really, it's actually fascinating to hear that story, because the situation in Sheffield has almost moved from being one of the worst sites of protest to actually leading the way with best practice around figuring out a collaborative strategy for managing the trees in the city and listening to everybody's interests. And you just described how, you know, the UK's major new environment bill actually has what's being referred to as the Sheffield clause in it, that will require city councils, local authorities to consult with residents on their street trees. So I'm always really interested, what was, if you could say there was kind of one turning point in getting from that incredibly intense, you know, combative, protest-based situation in Sheffield to where Sheffield is now, and where that kind of collaborative framework is now, what was that turning point?
So I think the main turning point was the Forestry Commission's report that was insisted on essentially by pressure, that, you know, it was all about a felling license. The Forestry Commission's there to manage forestry in the UK. It's about timber and tree production for industry. It's not about looking after trees and woodland. But there is a law that requires a license before felling a certain volume of trees under that they call it, it's a forestry license, essentially to prevent forests being depleted of timber. That's what the purpose of it is. But actually the number of trees at that point, 5,000 plus, that had been felled could come under that license requirement.
So they'd actually taken down so many trees that they were almost being seen as in the same way that we would see people who were deforesting.
Yeah, essentially. But the trouble is, this is where it all gets even more complex. Because of those risks associated with highways, you know, there is a Highways Act which requires highways to be managed and kept open for safety. So therefore, a highways authority has a duty to ensure that the roads are safe. Now, it was taken at the time that Highways Act trumps the Forestry Act, because forestry is about the production of timber, not about the safety of people. The question came around then that actually the duty is to make sure that the road is safe. It doesn't mean that a council can fell trees preemptively to make sure it's safe in the future. So it's a power rather than a duty, and it gets very legally technical at that point. But essentially, yeah, you know, the report heavily criticised the council and the decisions that had been made, but found not enough evidence to prove that that volume of timber had been unnecessarily felled within the time frame that the licenses apply.
Fascinating history of really, yeah, the biggest, certainly the most high profile tree protest that the UK's seen. What do you think the Sheffield situation changed in the UK in terms of your job as a campaigner and in terms of how the public feel about street trees?
I think it's massively increased public awareness of urban trees and the threat that they're actually under. I think lockdown and COVID has also added to that by, you know, we're more aware of the trees that we're near. But I think, yeah, from a public perspective, it's seeing the value and seeing the risk at what happens when it's lost, when it's too late, when the chainsaws were already on site. You know, there's not a lot that people can do at that point. So people are now preemptively looking for issues with their trees, and you know, we've got a massive casework load of people with concerns about their trees coming to us. I think it's also changed the behaviour of a lot of councils, because now they are seen to be under scrutiny for tree management a lot more than perhaps they were in the past. You know, I only need to talk about the fact that I've worked on Sheffield, and I'm invited to a lot more meetings with councils to help them work out a potential issue that they might have with some trees going forwards. And then at the government level, I think its legacy is the fact that it's shown, in a good way, it's shown actually how the system is broken, and it shows the potential for this new way of thinking about it to be the solution to that. So, the collaborative approach to writing strategies, it just gives me a lot more confidence that those residents in Sheffield have a voice now. And also, that's a perfect case, a perfect example case study to share with other councils, and a model for government to be thinking about, what it requires of its local authority.
If you could have one thing change in terms of how we look after street trees in the UK in the next 5 years, what would it be? What have we got left to do?
I think
you can have two.
I'll just say it's two-pronged. So it needs appropriate resourcing. It needs funding and budgets to see trees and tree management as a statutory obligation. So at the moment, a council, it's green, it's parks, it's countryside, it's tree management. They're all nice to have, but they're not essential services that authority provides. You're talking about social care, healthcare, education. Those are priorities, and rightly so. But I think if trees and tree management was put on a similar footing because of all the benefits to each of those services and more, I think that's when you can have the confidence that the council is setting appropriate budgets to properly manage and plant more trees. And then at the same time, it's the human resource to do it. Mm. So, a tree officer is a very technical, skilled profession. It's not just a guy with a chainsaw who knows how to cut a tree down. And that's got to be really understood by councils and members of the public too, which is why I'm excited about courses like this. Excuse me. I'm excited about courses like this that are actually introducing the next generation of conservationists and specialists who might see an interesting career in being a tree officer, because actually it should be one of the best careers out there. But at the moment, there is a lack of skills and expertise and interest in getting into these sorts of industries, because if the funding's not there to do a good job of it, then it's a hard life being a tree officer. So I think, more staff, bigger, better budgets, and having it written into some sort of statutory duty from the government down, but also within a local authority, and having the right influential people that listen to those qualified experts as well.
That's really fascinating. And I guess it comes as background to what we started with, of saying that, as really our whole society moves towards a place where we think differently about how we value greenery and the ecosystem and our planet, and that the way that sits against our old monetary value-based systems, there's a lot of things that need to change, and trees are sort of wrapped up in that, really, aren't they? I guess, in a way.
They really are. Let's not be mistaken. Climate change is the biggest crisis that we face, so it should be, one of the big focuses for all of us at this time. And trees are the tangible thing for people. There are all sorts of ecosystem things we should be doing for biodiversity and everything, but trees are tangible, and because of that emotive connection, actually it's a way to reach out to people and change behaviors, make people think more sustainably through the lens of trees and tree planting.
Thanks so much for talking to us. That's absolutely fascinating, and good luck with your campaigning.
So whilst we might love seeing big, beautiful trees with majestic canopies on our streets, there are real issues with bringing them safely into spaces if we're going to keep our cities accessible for everybody, from wheelchair users, from people pushing prams, and to those of us who are just a little bit infirm on our feet. So if we have a look at this tree behind us, this isn't even a particularly big tree, but already there's bumpy bits on the pavements that you could trip over. And that's because this tree's roots are lifting these pavements. And there are ways to engineer this so that that doesn't happen, but they cost a lot of money. So I'm sat at what was a roundabout at the end of Kingsway with the Dragon Hotel just across the other side. And Kingsway has seen some of the most frequent developments and changes in Swansea. Kingsway has gone from being a two-way street to a one-way street and finally back to being a two-way street again, just in a really small number of years. And all of those redevelopments have really impacted the landscape. This area around Kingsway was one of the areas that had the largest and most mature and most majestic trees within the city centre. We're in what's called Castle Ward, and it's one of the areas that has the least green infrastructure, the fewest green spaces. So when Swansea City Council announced in 2018 plans as part of this redevelopment to fell up to 50 of the big trees along Kingsway, Orchard Street, Alexandra Road, Dillabesh Road, all this area behind me, residents really quickly set up a protest group called Save Swansea's Trees to complain about this felling and just to ask questions about why this hugely important green asset of their city was being removed for redevelopment. Within a few days, the Save Swansea's Trees petition had reached 6,000 signatures, and it started a phase of real street tree protests within our city. The thing about the big trees in our cities is that by the time they get to be a big, mature tree, tens and tens of feet high with a big 60 centimetre diameter trunk, they have already been through a lot. They are the survivors. They are really, really well adapted for the place where they're living. And when we compare what they're doing for the city and doing for nature compared to some of the little lollipop landscaping that we saw earlier in the video, it's just not comparable. And really, when we value these trees for everything that they're doing, it is worth the engineering solutions to keep them in our cities. So in response to the Save Swansea's Trees petition, the council said the tree felling that we're planning will, for example, remove trees which are unhealthy or where heaving roots are causing problems by cracking up pavements or damaging underground infrastructure like drains and gas pipes and buildings. And our new trees will then be able to mature without damaging pavements or without creating trip hazards for pedestrians. So what you'll see happens in the news media through 2018 and through 2019 is the stories and the social media posts from Save Swansea's Trees, from Swansea City Council and from the Swansea Tree Forum that developed in response to the Kingsway fellings bounce backwards and forwards, with residents groups asking for felling of mature trees to stop and the council producing press releases again and again talking about greening up the city and the fact that there will be more trees in the city after their developments as they push their agenda in the press to cover up the removal of mature trees for development and to replace them with larger numbers of smaller trees. And this debate backwards and forwards reveals the real problem with large trees in our city centres. Whilst they pose such an important part of our green infrastructure, big trees in the wrong place are really, really difficult to manage. So we've had a bit of an introduction to street tree protests and urban woodland using examples of Sheffield and Swansea. We talked to some experts and we've had a chance to raise some of the questions around street trees in our urban environment that are really a source of modern 21st century geography challenge in our cities. So your assignment for this project is to calculate, using a program called Tree Plotter, the value of street trees in the area where you live. We're going to compare and contrast what genuine green infrastructure value we get from big trees versus small trees and have a think about the problems, the challenges and the benefits of our street trees.